When we begin talking about avoidant personalities, one of the biggest misconceptions people have is that avoidants simply do not want connection. They assume distance means indifference. They assume silence means a lack of care. But psychologically, that interpretation is often inaccurate. What you are actually observing is not a rejection of connection. It is a nervous system protecting itself from emotional overload. Avoidant individuals are extremely sensitive to emotional intensity, even if they appear calm or detached on the surface. Their internal system is constantly scanning for signals that a situation might become emotionally chaotic, demanding, or unpredictable. When communication feels overwhelming, long emotional texts, accusations, emotional pressure, constant demands for reassurance, the avoidant brain reads this not as intimacy, but as threat. And the moment the brain detects threat, it activates distance. This is not always conscious. In fact, most avoidants cannot clearly explain why they suddenly pull back. They just feel an internal pressure that says, I need space. I need to get out of this emotional situation. Their silence, their withdrawal, their detachment, these are not strategies designed to punish someone. They are strategies designed to regulate internal overwhelm. Now, here is where the dynamic becomes fascinating. When an avoidant encounters someone who communicates in a calm, structured, emotionally grounded way, something very different happens in their nervous system. Instead of preparing for emotional chaos, their system begins to relax. The conversation does not feel like an emotional storm they must survive. It feels predictable, contained, safe, and safety is the key word here. Most avoidants grew up in environments where emotional expression was either discouraged, criticized, or wildly inconsistent. Love may have existed, but it was often unpredictable. Sometimes there was closeness. Sometimes there was tension. Sometimes emotions were overwhelming and difficult to process. Over time, the mind adapts to this by building a strategy. Limit emotional exposure. Distance becomes protection. But when communication arrives in a format that is calm and emotionally regulated, clear words, steady tone, no sudden emotional explosions, the avoidant experiences something unusual. They experience connection without the familiar sense of danger. Think about the psychological impact of that. For someone who has spent years associating emotional closeness with pressure, conflict, or expectation, encountering a person who communicates with calm clarity feels almost disarming. There is no urgency, no emotional ambush, no hidden demand beneath the words, just communication. And this begins to lower their defenses. Now, at first, the avoidant may still maintain distance. That protective habit does not disappear overnight. But internally, their nervous system begins forming a new association. Instead of linking this person with emotional exhaustion, they begin linking them with emotional stability. And human beings naturally move toward what stabilizes them. This is why avoidants often become quietly fascinated by people who communicate this way. They may not openly express it. They may not even fully understand it themselves, but subconsciously their mind registers something rare. This interaction does not drain me. It does not trap me. It does not overwhelm me. It steadies me. And when someone becomes associated with that kind of emotional steadiness, the avoidant begins to relax in their presence. The walls soften. The distance becomes less rigid. What once felt threatening begins to feel manageable. And from that place, something important becomes possible, real connection. Because at the deepest level, avoidants are not searching for distance. They are searching for connection that does not cost them their emotional stability. And the moment someone communicates in a way that honors that need, the avoidant no longer feels the urge to escape. They begin, slowly and quietly, to stay. And the truth is simple. When you create emotional safety for someone who has spent a lifetime defending themselves from emotional chaos, you do not chase their attention. You naturally become someone they do not want to lose. Another powerful dynamic operating beneath the surface of avoidant behavior is the fear of losing autonomy. To understand avoidance, you have to understand that independence is not just a preference for them. It is a psychological survival strategy. Somewhere in their past, often very early in life, closeness became associated with pressure, expectations, or emotional obligations they felt unable to meet. So their mind developed a rule: stay connected, but never lose control of your freedom. This is why traditional relationship communication often backfires with avoidant individuals. Many people believe that if they just express more feelings, ask more questions, or push for more emotional clarity, the avoidant will eventually open up. But from the avoidant's perspective, those behaviors can feel less like intimacy and more like confinement. When communication carries an underlying tone of demand, why didn't you call? Where is this going? What are we? Why don't you open up more? The avoidant nervous system interprets it as a narrowing of their freedom. And the moment someone feels their freedom shrinking, they instinctively create distance. It is not because they do not care. In many cases, the opposite is true. The more emotionally significant the connection becomes, the stronger that internal alarm can get. Their mind begins projecting a future where closeness slowly turns into obligation, where emotional expectations multiply, and where their independence slowly disappears. Even if the other person never intended that outcome, the avoidance psychological conditioning prepares for it anyway, so they retreat. Now here is where communication style changes everything. When someone communicates in a format that is clear but non-demanding, something shifts in the avoidance internal experience. Instead of feeling pulled into a corner, they feel respected. Instead of sensing emotional pressure, they sense space. The message becomes less about extracting reassurance and more about simply sharing information or perspective. For example, consider the difference between emotional pursuit and calm clarity. Emotional pursuit might sound like this: "Why do you keep pulling away from me? I need to know where this is going." But calm clarity sounds different. It might sound like, "I enjoy spending time with you. I value consistency in relationships. So that's something I look for. I'm curious how you see things." The words themselves are not dramatically different in meaning, but the structure of the communication is different. One creates pressure, the other creates space, and space is oxygen for the avoidant mind. When someone communicates in a way that allows the avoidant to maintain their sense of autonomy, something remarkable happens. The avoidant no longer feels the need to defend their independence. There is no emotional tug of war, no sense that they are being pulled somewhere against their will. Instead, the connection begins to feel voluntary. And voluntary connection is the only kind that avoidants truly trust. Over time, this creates an interesting psychological reversal. When avoidants stop feeling pursued, they often begin leaning closer on their own. Curiosity replaces resistance. Instead of thinking about escape, they begin thinking about engagement. They start asking questions. They start initiating conversations, not because someone demanded it, but because the environment feels free enough for them to choose it. This is one of the great paradoxes of human behavior. The more someone feels their autonomy is respected, the more willingly they participate in connection. Freedom, when honored, does not destroy intimacy. It actually strengthens it. For avoidants, this is particularly powerful. When they meet someone who communicates without emotional pressure, who expresses interest without creating obligation, they experience something rare: a relationship dynamic where closeness does not threaten independence. And that changes everything, because when someone realizes they can be connected without feeling trapped, their defensive instincts begin to relax. The walls they built to protect their freedom slowly become unnecessary. And in that moment, connection stops feeling like a cage. It begins to feel like a choice. And the deepest truth about human relationships is this: the moment someone feels free to leave is often the moment they finally choose to stay. There is another dynamic that often goes unnoticed when people try to understand avoidant behavior, and it has to do with emotional regulation. Not emotional suppression, not emotional coldness, but the ability to experience feelings without letting those feelings spiral into chaos. For an avoidant personality, this quality can be profoundly magnetic. Think about what many avoidants experience growing up. In many cases, emotions in their early environment were either dismissed entirely or expressed in ways that felt overwhelming. Some grew up in homes where vulnerability was met with criticism or indifference. Others grew up around emotional volatility, arguments, dramatic reactions, unpredictable shifts in mood. In both situations, the lesson absorbed by the nervous system was similar. Emotions are dangerous territory. So the avoidant mind developed a strategy: control your emotions, minimize them, step away from situations where emotional intensity begins to rise. From the outside, this can look like detachment, but internally, it is often a form of self-protection. Now imagine what happens when an avoidant encounters someone who handles emotions differently. Not someone who suppresses feelings, but someone who expresses them with composure. Someone who can say, that situation bothered me, without raising their voice, without escalating into blame, without turning the conversation into a storm of accusations. To the average person, that might seem like normal communication, but to an avoidant nervous system, it can feel surprisingly reassuring, because emotional regulation sends a very specific signal. This situation is manageable. When someone communicates calmly, they are demonstrating something powerful at a psychological level. They are showing that emotions do not have to explode in order to be expressed. They are showing that conflict does not automatically lead to chaos. And most importantly, they are showing that connection can exist without emotional overwhelm. For an avoidant, that experience is rare. What begins to happen over time is subtle but important. The avoidant starts associating that person with a sense of emotional stability. Conversations feel smoother. Interactions feel lighter. Instead of preparing themselves for emotional turbulence, their nervous system begins to relax in that person's presence. And human beings naturally gravitate toward environments that regulate their stress. This is where attraction can begin to form in a quiet but powerful way. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily passionate at first, but deeply compelling. The avoidant may find themselves wanting to talk to this person more often. They may linger in conversations longer than usual. They may even start sharing small pieces of themselves they normally keep private. Why? Because emotional regulation creates psychological safety. When someone consistently demonstrates that they can handle emotions without creating pressure, blame, or intensity, they become a kind of emotional anchor. The avoidant mind begins to trust that being around this person will not lead to the exhausting emotional scenarios they are used to avoiding. And trust, for avoidance, grows slowly but deeply. It is important to understand that this does not mean avoidants suddenly become emotionally expressive overnight. Their habits of distance may still appear. They may still take space. But the difference is that they begin to return. They come back to the conversations, back to the interaction, because it does not drain them. In fact, it steadies them. And that steadiness becomes something they unconsciously seek out. When life becomes stressful or overwhelming, they remember the person who communicates calmly, who does not react impulsively, who does not turn every emotion into a crisis. That presence becomes grounding. This is why emotional regulation is so powerful in relationships with avoidant individuals. It shows them a version of emotional connection that does not threaten their internal balance. It proves that closeness does not have to mean chaos. And when someone realizes that being around you actually makes their inner world calmer instead of more complicated, something very powerful begins to happen. They stop guarding themselves quite so tightly. Because the truth is simple. The person who brings calm into someone's emotional life often becomes the person they quietly begin to depend on. Another element that plays a profound role in the psychology of avoidant individuals is the way trust is formed. For many people, trust grows through emotional openness, frequent reassurance, and constant dialogue about feelings. But for avoidants, trust often develops through something quieter and far more subtle: structured honesty. To understand this, you have to look at the environment many avoidants were shaped by. In a lot of cases, emotional communication around them was confusing. Messages were mixed. Feelings were hinted at instead of spoken clearly. Expectations were implied but never fully explained. Sometimes love was present, but the way it was expressed carried layers of tension, guilt, or unpredictability. Over time, this creates a psychological pattern. The avoidant mind becomes extremely sensitive to emotional ambiguity. When communication feels unclear, when someone says one thing but emotionally implies another, the avoidant brain begins searching for the hidden meaning behind the words. And that search can feel exhausting. This is why honesty alone is not always enough. Honesty delivered through emotional intensity can still overwhelm them. What makes the real difference is honesty that arrives with structure. Clear, simple, direct. When someone communicates in this format, something interesting happens. The avoidant does not feel emotionally cornered. They do not feel like they have to decode hidden messages or defend themselves against accusations disguised as vulnerability. Instead, they receive information in a way that feels manageable. Think about the difference between these two approaches. One person might say, "I feel like you don't care about me anymore. You've been distant, and it's really hurting me." Even though the statement is emotionally honest, it carries a weight that can immediately trigger the avoidance defensive system. The conversation now feels like a confrontation. But structured honesty sounds different. It might sound like, "I've noticed we haven't talked as much this week. I value consistent communication in relationships, so I wanted to share that." The message is still honest. The feeling is still expressed. But the structure of the communication removes the emotional pressure that often pushes avoidance away. What this does psychologically is incredibly important. It allows the avoidant to process the message without feeling attacked or overwhelmed. Their mind does not immediately move into protection mode. Instead, it stays open long enough to actually hear what is being said. And when someone consistently communicates this way, clear observations, calm statements, no emotional traps, the avoidant begins to experience something that may have been rare in their past. Predictable honesty. Predictability builds trust. It tells the avoidant that this person is not trying to manipulate their emotions. It tells them there are no hidden demands lurking beneath the conversation. What is being said is simply what is meant. Over time, this begins to change the way the avoidant relates to that person. Conversations start feeling easier. There is less mental effort required to navigate the interaction. The avoidant no longer feels like they are stepping into an emotional maze every time a serious topic appears. Instead, communication starts to feel like a stable exchange, and when communication feels stable, the avoidant mind relaxes. This is where trust begins to deepen, not through dramatic emotional confessions, but through repeated experiences of clarity. Each calm, honest interaction reinforces the same message. This relationship does not require constant emotional defense. And once that realization takes root, the avoidant slowly becomes more willing to engage. They start offering more responses. They may begin sharing thoughts they previously kept to themselves. The walls do not collapse overnight, but they do begin to lower. Because trust, especially for avoidance, grows less from emotional intensity and more from emotional reliability. When someone proves again and again that their words are clear, their intentions are direct, and their communication carries no hidden pressure, the avoidant stops bracing for emotional impact. They start listening. And when someone finally feels safe enough to listen without defending themselves, trust stops being something they resist. It becomes something they quietly begin to build. As we continue exploring the psychology behind avoidant behavior, there is another factor that quietly shapes almost every interaction they have with others, and that is predictability. For many avoidant individuals, communication itself is not the problem. The real issue is the uncertainty that often surrounds emotional conversations. When communication becomes unpredictable, when tone shifts suddenly, when emotions escalate quickly, when conversations move from calm to intense without warning, the avoidant nervous system begins to prepare for emotional overload. And once that preparation begins, withdrawal often follows. Not necessarily because they want to disconnect, but because distance feels like the only way to restore internal balance. Imagine constantly feeling as though a conversation could turn into an emotional storm at any moment. Even if the storm never fully arrives, the anticipation alone can create tension. Over time, the avoidant mind begins associating emotional conversations with this sense of unpredictability. So what do? They minimize those conversations. They delay responses. They pull away when things start to feel complicated. From the outside, it may appear as though they are uninterested or disengaged. But internally, their mind is simply trying to avoid situations that feel emotionally chaotic. Now consider what happens when someone communicates in a way that is steady and predictable. The tone remains calm. The message is clear. There are no sudden emotional escalations, no dramatic shifts in energy. Conversations unfold at a measured pace. At first, the avoidant may still maintain their usual distance. Their habits have been built over years, sometimes decades. But gradually, something begins to change. Their nervous system starts recognizing a pattern. This interaction is not chaotic. This conversation is not going to spiral into conflict. There is no emotional trap waiting around the corner. And once the brain begins recognizing that pattern, the need for withdrawal begins to soften. Predictability has a powerful psychological effect. It reduces cognitive load. It allows the mind to relax because it no longer needs to constantly scan for potential emotional threats. Instead of preparing for impact, the avoidant can simply participate in the conversation. That shift may seem small, but its impact is significant. When someone no longer feels the need to protect themselves from emotional unpredictability, they naturally become more present. They listen more carefully. They respond more thoughtfully. Conversations begin to feel less like something to escape escape and more like something they can actually handle. And slowly, the dynamic between the two people changes. Instead of the familiar push and pull pattern, one person pursuing while the other withdraws, the interaction becomes more balanced. The avoidant no longer feels chased by emotional intensity, so they stop running from it. In fact, something even more interesting begins to happen. When communication feels predictable, the avoidant may start leaning into conversations that they previously avoided. They may stay engaged longer. They may return to discussions that once would have caused them to disappear, because the fear driving their withdrawal is no longer being activated. Human behavior often follows a simple principle. We move away from what overwhelms us, and we move toward what stabilizes us. For avoidants, unpredictable emotional exchanges have long represented overwhelm, but predictable communication represents something entirely different. It represents control, clarity, and emotional safety. Over time, this creates a new internal association. Instead of seeing conversations as potential sources of pressure, the avoidant begins seeing them as manageable experiences. And once communication becomes manageable, the impulse to escape loses its urgency. This is why consistency matters so much. One calm conversation may not change much, but many calm conversations repeated over time reshape the entire emotional atmosphere of the relationship. Eventually, the avoidant stops anticipating chaos. They start expecting calm. And when someone realizes that interacting with you does not destabilize their world, but actually helps organize it, their instinct to withdraw begins to fade. Because at the deepest psychological level, people do not run from connection itself. They run from the feeling that connection will overwhelm them. When you put all of these dynamics together, emotional safety, respect for autonomy, calm emotional regulation, structured honesty, and predictable communication, you begin to see something remarkable happening inside the avoidant mind. At first, the changes are subtle. The avoidant may still keep their distance. They may still take time to respond, but internally, a new association is slowly forming. The experience of interacting with you begins to feel different from what they are used to. For most avoidants, relationships have historically carried a certain emotional cost. Closeness often meant pressure, conversations meant expectations, emotional discussions meant intensity. Over time, their mind learned to associate connection with a kind of psychological fatigue. Even when they cared about someone deeply, being emotionally engaged could feel draining. But when communication happens in the format we've been discussing, calm, clear, respectful, emotionally grounded, that familiar cost begins to disappear. Instead of feeling overwhelmed after conversations, the avoidant may actually feel lighter. Instead of needing space to recover from emotional intensity, they find that the interaction itself did not create that intensity in the first place. The exchange was calm. The words were direct. There was no pressure to perform emotionally, no demand to immediately reveal every feeling or solve every relational question. Just communication that felt balanced. And this is where a powerful psychological shift begins to occur. The avoidant mind starts associating this person with emotional relief. Human beings are naturally drawn toward environments that reduce internal stress. If someone consistently creates a space where our mind feels calmer, clearer, and less defensive, we begin to seek out that experience, not always consciously, but instinctively. For the avoidant, this can feel surprising. They may not fully understand why they feel comfortable around a particular person. They may simply notice that conversations feel easier, that silence between interactions does not carry tension, that returning to the connection does not require emotional recovery. What they are experiencing is something their nervous system deeply appreciates: stability. And stability has a quiet power. Over time, the avoidant may begin initiating contact more often. They may check in unexpectedly. They may linger in conversations that once would have felt too emotionally complicated. The pattern of withdrawal becomes less rigid because the original reason for that withdrawal, emotional overwhelm, is no longer present. In a sense, the connection becomes a place where their internal system can rest. This is why some avoidants develop a strong attachment to people who communicate in this format. From the outside, it can look almost contradictory. The same person who once seemed distant or disengaged begins showing curiosity, attentiveness, even subtle emotional investment. What changed was not their fundamental personality. What changed was the emotional environment of the relationship. When someone consistently communicates with clarity, emotional steadiness, and respect for psychological boundaries, they create something extremely rare in the avoidance experience: connection without emotional chaos. And once someone experiences that kind of connection, it becomes difficult to ignore. not because they suddenly crave intensity, but because they recognize something their mind has been searching for all along. A relationship dynamic where closeness does not threaten their inner stability. In many ways, this is why the word addiction sometimes gets used to describe the pull avoidants feel toward this type of communication. It is not addiction in a clinical sense. It is a powerful preference, a recognition that being around this person makes their emotional world feel more organized, more peaceful, more manageable. And human beings rarely walk away from what stabilizes them. So the avoidant who once distanced themselves from overwhelming relationships begins to lean toward the person who makes connection feel simple, the one who communicates clearly, the one who stays emotionally grounded, the one who never turns communication into chaos. Because when someone becomes the calmest place in another person's emotional world, they stop being just another relationship. They become a place the mind naturally wants to return to. And the deepest truth about connection is this. People may resist pressure, they may escape intensity, but they almost never walk away from the person who consistently brings them peace. As we step back and look at the full picture, something important becomes clear about avoidant behavior. What often looks like indifference, distance, or emotional coldness is rarely about a lack of feeling. More often, it is about protection. Protection from emotional chaos, from pressure, from losing the sense of internal stability that allows them to function in the world. Avoidants are not people who do not want connection. They are people who have learned through experience that connection can sometimes come at a psychological cost. And so they build walls, not because they hate closeness, but because they fear the overwhelm that closeness has represented in the past. But when someone communicates in a different format, when their words are calm, when their tone is grounded, when their honesty is clear but not demanding, when their presence respects both connection and freedom, something inside the avoidant begins to shift. The nervous system relaxes, the constant scanning for emotional danger slows down, and the walls that once felt necessary begin to feel less important. Because for the first time, the avoidant experiences something rare. Connection that does not threaten their sense of stability. Conversations feel manageable. Emotions feel contained rather than explosive. The relationship no longer feels like something they must escape in order to breathe. It feels like something they can actually stay in. And that is the quiet transformation most people never see. Avoidants do not open up because they were chased hard enough, convinced strongly enough, or emotionally pushed into vulnerability. They open up when the environment stops triggering their need to defend themselves, when communication becomes clear instead of chaotic, when honesty arrives without pressure, when emotions are expressed with stability instead of intensity. That is when the avoidant mind begins to trust the connection rather than fear it. So the lesson here is not about trying to control someone else's psychology. It is about understanding the power of the emotional environment we create through the way we communicate. The format of our communication, our tone, our clarity, our emotional steadiness, shapes whether a relationship feels safe or threatening to the person on the other side. And when you become someone whose communication brings calm instead of chaos, clarity instead of confusion, stability instead of pressure, you change the entire dynamic of the connection. Because the truth is simple and profound. People may run from intensity, they may resist pressure, they may withdraw from emotional chaos, but they rarely walk away from the person who consistently makes their world feel calmer. And in the end, the most powerful form of influence in any relationship is not control, persuasion, or emotional force. It is the quiet strength of being the safest place someone's mind can return to.